I left Colgate after about 7 years and then joined Nike, as you said, in 1992. And that was really just an eye-opening experience because it was the first time that I was working on something where I felt like my passion, what I really enjoyed, and I loved playing sports, met kind of my profession, right? And those two things came together. And so I went on a journey. I was beginning in New York City, went from there, went to work on Latin America, was the head of marketing for Latin America. Then I became the head of marketing for Europe. Then I became the head of marketing for North America. Then I became the CMO. And then from there, I went to another role where I basically ran what was called our categories, as well as the CMO role. And then I became the president of the brand. But just to maybe put some things in perspective, I joined the company when the company was around about maybe $1 billion plus, almost maybe $1.5 billion. And by the time I left Nike, the company was about $37 billion. So I saw an incredible growth rise in the company, and really had a chance to play a role in that growth, but also sort of like learn a lot of the things along the way.
Fantastic. Well, that's phenomenal. And one of the key things you were really instrumental in doing at Nike was get this synergy between sports purists that sort of like grew out of the very beginnings of Nike as a track and field brand and of track and field product, and getting a synergy between those sports purists and the more fashion forward fan. You got that synergy exactly right, and it led to that exponential growth. How did you find the balance between those two different sets of values?
Oh yeah, that's it's interesting because as you rightly sort of pointed out, it was actually a huge inflection point in the company, as well as a huge cultural challenge in the company. And many of the people who began, in the earliest days at Nike, they were runners. If you think about Nike, Nike was born in Portland, in Beaverton, Oregon. And it was Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight, right? And so everybody who was a part of that company were runners, and they were very clear about the consumers they served. They went to track and field events to make sure that they actually could serve those consumers or those athletes really well. As the company continued to grow and went into other sports, the company had to learn how to do that. So, but what was united at that point was that it was sports and it was athletes. And so as the company sort of was growing, this conflict sort of develops because people were actually using the product for non-sports reasons. And, part of what my role was to really help the company understand how could we anchor the brand in sports, but at the same time expand the brand to connect to other consumers. And one of the things I believe very strongly in is that you've got to pay attention to the real consumers, what they say, what they do, what they want. And if you understand that, you can figure out how to make that transition. So in terms of conflicting values, it was challenging values. And what I had to do was help unite people on the idea that it was sport at its core, but people had different ways to access sport, right? You might have been a runner or a basketballer, you played sports, that's where your passion was. Somebody who watched it was equally as passionate. They might not have been as good as you on the playing field, but they might know a hell of a lot more about sports than you might, right? Or they might have a passion for sports. So it was always like find that passion for sports, and how could we expand the brand by expanding those passion points? And that's what you see today. At one point at Nike, if you said the word fashion, it was almost like you were going to be excommunicated. They would throw you out of the company. Nobody wanted to. It was in that degree of sort of like, a very almost like zealot sort of focus that you had to be about athletes. And so managing that transition was a really important point. But you do it by anchoring the brand about who you are and making sure you give people real reasons as to why they would bring your brand into their life. Right? Because that's the most important thing. It's still the consumer's world. And it's like, how does the brand participate in their life? Not how do they participate in your world? It's another way of thinking.
Absolutely. And so in the organizational culture of Nike, which at this point is one of the legendary corporate cultures in American history, when that culture clash between sports purists that maybe had ties back to Nike's origins and up and coming executives like you who are leading the charge and reinventing the brand, how did that clash manifest itself in organizational decision making, and how did you navigate that clash so well for so long?
Yeah, it's the thing that for me, it was less about an internal conflict, and I'm not saying that it didn't exist. It did, and it manifests itself in many, many ways in terms of like power structures, who's in charge, who makes this decision, where is really the centering of the company, who's in, who's out. And for me, all of those things were kind of irrelevant. They were irrelevant because if you exist to serve consumers, your look should be outside, not inside. You look to who you serve and you make sure you understand their lives, their experiences, how they're evolving. And that's how brands actually stay relevant over a period of time. If you become sort of like constrained by dogma, like our beliefs, this is how things are, they are this way always, you could never grow, you can't expand. And we've seen it in any system that has that sort of such a fixed view doesn't actually survive over time. So for me, it was bringing that external perspective internally, bringing the voice of the consumer inside the company, bringing the voice of the athlete inside the company, because the athletes that were growing up in today's world, right, back even then, they had much more interest. They weren't just like basketball players, runners. You know, they liked other things. They liked fashion. They liked style, right? They liked just, pop culture. And what made Nike interested was its ability to tap into pop culture and times it by sports. Fashion, times it by sports, right? Design, times it by sports. So if you kept sports at the center and you allowed different sort of perspectives to help, at those intersections, that's what actually helped the business to grow in certain ways. So my task was to bring that voice of the external, the consumer, internal, and make sure everyone spent time wanting to serve that. And that was, so I always said, it's not about me, it's really about them, right? And so any which way you could bring that voice in, we did that over and over again.
It's fascinating. And so when you think about that them from expanded from any type of nativist consideration and make it global, how did you apply that discipline of Nike getting that culture brand synergy as you move the brand across different markets around the world?
It's a really, really powerful point too, because again, a brand that was born in Oregon, and that brand now has to expand around the world. And for Nike to become a global company, we felt the most important global or worldwide sport, or the most popular sport around the world, was football, soccer, right? It's not the most popular sport in the United States. And so therein even lies a very okay, is basketball more important than football? But it was more like, what's great about basketball? What's great about football? Where do they intersect? And how could we actually succeed in the sport of football? And I'll give you that example. So in 1993, Nike's football business was $34 million. $34 million. By the year 2001, Nike's football soccer business was $2 billion. So we grew that exponentially by focusing in on how could we serve the footballer. And what we did is we decided to focus on the young footballers, the footballers who were coming up. everyone believed that football was a local sport, that if your favorite team was always your country's team, but not many paid attention to the most favorite team in the world was the Brazil national team. And so even though people had their first favorite, Brazil was the world's favorite team. And so we used Brazil as the story point for how the brand was going to bring a new type of football. We focused on this young player called Ronaldo. And this was the first Ronaldo. This is not the one, this is not the Portuguese Ronaldo. This is the original Brazilian Ronaldo. And we focused with him, and we actually created the mercurial vapor. And I can see somebody flagged it up. Yes, the mercurial, exactly right. I was going to bring it. I couldn't find it today. I was like, I wanted to show it. But we focused it on him. And basically, we used that, his creativity, the way he played, and the fact that everybody wanted to play like the Brazilians. And so we were able to go from 34 to $2 billion. And this is a category that was led by Adidas. So if and you guys all study marketing and business, it's not easy to come from that position and actually overtake and become the leader of a sport, right? But Nike did, and it did that by understanding the consumer, understanding their context, and their context was different than what people had presumed years before about football.
That's amazing.
There's so much in there I could say, but
no,
I get too excited. So
I love it. And I'm actually going to elaborate on it a little bit. When we last spoke, you were in a different office or a different venue. And over your right shoulder or your left shoulder was a photo of the Brazilian World Cup team from years gone by. And you actually said in an interview that if Nike were a country, it would be Brazil. Yes. So two things. Why would Nike be Brazil? Elaborating on the point you were just making. And number two, tell us about, paint the photograph or, depict what I saw in my call with you for people who are on the call now.
Yeah, so it was a picture of the 1970 World Cup. It was in Mexico City, and it's where Brazil is playing against Italy. It was actually the first time that I really I played football. As I said, I was from London. My dad's favorite team was also Brazil. And I remember and it was the first time actually that we had color TV. So I know you're looking at me kind of going, really? You're that old, dude? This is the first time they had color TV, right? So we saw football in color. And it was amazing because the Brazil team was diverse. The Brazil team, was a team of different shades of people, all playing in this fun, creative way. Pele, if you remember, was the top player, right? And so my passion for football also came from seeing this idea that different groups of people could come together and play something amazing. So in a way, and play it creatively and with fun and with enjoyment. And I thought that represented what I always aspired for Nike to be a company that was diverse, different kinds of people, or everyone with a passion for the same sport, playing together to win. And using creativity, right? And recognizing the differences, but yet letting those differences actually help you be better. And so that's a little bit why Brazil always represented that to me. And so, I had that just viewpoint of just the soul of Brazil. And I'm a bit of a Braziliophile, so I'll tell anybody that. I've been there many times, and I just always found the culture supremely interesting because you just met such different people, but they always had this sort of genuineness about them. So I don't want to go on too long because I can.
No. That's phenomenal. And so football really helped accelerate Nike around the world. Here in America, we think basketball first is the accelerant, but globally it was football.
Yeah.
So in 2008, one of the main sort of revamps of Nike internally you helped lead was actually segmenting the brand by sport.
Yeah.
And really making specific sporting disciplines within the brand instead of one meta Nike brand. Tell us a little bit about that and why you went in that direction.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. And it actually, football was actually the sort of test case for that. And essentially it was this idea that, and I would say this for all the business folks in the room, marketeers, whatever your zone that you're in, but no one needs another pair of sneakers, right? We don't really need it. We want it, but we don't need it. And so part of the way that we thought about driving growth of the business was that what if we spent time making sure we truly served that consumer, a basketballer, right? And their full lifestyle of basketball. So if they had a passion for basketball, like they liked playing the sport, they liked watching the sport, they liked adorning themselves with the sport, right? So you could have sport as really a full part of your life. A basketball player, a runner, right? Somebody who played soccer, right? So we basically broke the business up, which at the time was based on footwear, apparel, and equipment. And we basically sort of said, well, no, let's focus on the sport. Let's focus on the athlete themselves. Let's spend time thinking about them, their lifestyle, and think about how we can grow the business based on them, right? So it's a very consumer-centric view, which is to really study and understand the lifestyle, but also understand what they do before the sport, during the sport, and after the sport, and see if we can solve and find new innovations to actually create new products. That was the innovation that we used to basically create Nike Plus, which at the time when we did the partnership with Apple, it was essentially looking at runners. And we observed that runners, right, they would go out for a run, they would try and track how far they went. They carried an iPod with them to hear music, right? And they wanted to be motivated. So we were like, well, what if we could put that all together, right? But we couldn't do it alone. So we went to Apple and sort of created a partnership that said, what if we could serve that consumer with this new idea? So Nike ended up being the first app, the first external app that was actually on the iPod before like today, which now we all look at that and everybody goes, of course. But at the time, that wasn't even the vision and we met with Jobs, and that wasn't the vision that he had. And it was kind of like, okay, yeah, he liked Nike. He was like, okay, let's try and do something together. That's how we created that first running app, which has led to what you see today, which is many of sort of like where we see sport as a part of our lives. We don't have to go to a gym. All those things are a derivative idea that comes from paying attention to the consumer's lifestyle and see if you can solve from that perspective.
So in terms of knowing the consumer, accumulating knowledge of the consumer, having that relationship, while you were at Nike in key moments, what were the fundamental parts of your toolkit for getting that consumer knowledge and evolving it as trends and different types of demographic and other types of change happen?
Yeah.
How did you keep your finger on the pulse of the consumer?
Yeah.
And translate it into stories for the brand?
Yeah, I would offer this, and it's not trite when I say this, but I would say it's curiosity. It is always being curious. And if you can create a culture of curiosity, right? If you can create an organization where everyone is curious, meaning that you want to understand the why, not just what happened, but why it happened. Why do they like something? So you're always drilling down. So I had the benefit sort of like, one of the opportunities of the job is you get to meet people all over the world. We created teams that their jobs were to study the whys, right? So you spoke about the category teams or the sports segment teams, whether it was the women's team, the running team, the basketball team, their job was to understand the why of that consumer, right? Then if you made sure that everyone at retail was asking the whys, you're always asking everyone about like, okay, how do you combine, as I would say, intuition with information, right? And you put the two things together, but always asking why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? And it's in those whys that I think amazing sort of knowledge comes from, right? So then you can validate the whys or sort of see the parallels, right? Or see things that you could see in China that suddenly were applicable in the United States, or stuff that was applicable in Germany was somehow applicable in Japan. And so that ability to cross-pollinate those questions, if we were looking through the filter of a runner in London is quite similar to a runner in Japan, their whys are incredibly connected. So we could create these real benefits. So that was one of the techniques. So I don't say that with a trite way, but I said a lot of those things that you developed came from that basically, are you curious enough, right? Are we making sure we're listening to the voice of the consumer, the athlete? Is everyone doing it? Are we asking ourselves those questions? And can we combine intuition with the informed knowledge that you can increasingly get from data? But those two things really allow you to sort of uncover really great insights.
So 2 follow-ups on that. We have a digital social media master's program. We're also launching a digital media marketing master's program, both of which are going to obviously really emphasize social media and data analytics. What overall is your sort of viewpoint on the role of social media in understanding the consumer? There are all these social listening tools to hear what the consumer is saying. What's your view on the role of social media in getting to know your consumer?
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly powerful tool. And I think that one of the things one could say today is that we don't lack data, right? But perhaps we lack knowledge, right? It's the ability to distill the data into something that is either actionable, or one could sometimes also say almost every trend is happening all at once. Which one do you choose to actually act upon, right? So I think that social media provides an incredible sort of ability to listen, to learn, to hear, and also to test and sort of get response, to engage. The thing I would, even as you embark on the journey, I think one of the things I think about is also, as you talk about social media, in a way, I'm sometimes concerned it can become a trap, right? Because social media is really about human behavior, right? And if we study human behavior, then we can see how human behavior is impacted by social media and impacts social media. Because it's like, if you think about it to some extent, like 30, 40, 50 years ago, it would be like having a class in radio, right? It's like, is that the class you really want to have? Or do you want to have the class that talks about the people and what they're doing? And then the construct is they happen to use this vehicle, this tool set to do the things that they do, right? And this tool set allows certain things to happen that couldn't have happened if the tool set didn't exist, right? So the question that I always have is, what's the future tool set? This is one form of a tool set. There's some others coming that we yet can't really see. But if we pay attention to the human behavior, we'll have a better ability to think about how you use it, how you can leverage it, how you can access it on behalf of providing better services to your consumers.
That's an excellent insight. And just as a sidebar, in your time at Nike or even at Colgate Palmolive, did you ever collaborate with neuroscientists on kind of neural implications for certain brand stories or certain brand approaches, kind of like the neural marketing arena?
Yeah. We didn't really go fully into neural marketing, but we did when we started out on the Nike Plus work that we were doing. We did spend a lot of time sort of like looking at sort of like, actually and it's quite interesting now, because I've definitely seen it's that Netflix show where it's about addiction, right? So we looked at those dynamics, right? We looked at the dynamics and in our view was like, could you create a positive addiction, right? A positive addiction to working out. What would that be like, right? So we were looking at those behavioral, and we got behavioral scientists to help us sort of think about it, and psychologists, and we talked to them about like, okay, what were they finding? So we were looking at some of those, sort of like very advanced techniques. I don't know if we went as far as the neural work, but we definitely looked through the filter of athletes also about kind of like, what made them who they were in terms of their intensity in playing sports. But it was also early days, right? And so, but it again, it goes back to that trying to understand the why, but also making sure that the reason you're doing it is because you want to provide betterment in the world, right? Not the reason you're doing it is like, I don't want to create, it's like, is it great to create an addiction to buying? That's not cool. That's not where you want to be, right? I don't say companies don't do that. I just don't think that's ethically where they should spend the time. I think the thing is spend the time really on thinking about how do you better serve people, right? How do you make them feel more valued, more rewarded, feel like they have the right things? So, that may be a bit of a sidebar, but at least.
Yeah, no, I was just curious. I did throw it out there as a sidebar. Coming back more squarely to what you were talking about knowing your consumer. A lot of talk now, particularly in the midst of the pandemic, about an accelerant for the reinvention of retail. Nike had been founded on a whole network of mom and pop retailers and some, big anchor locations in malls. With the acceleration of the shift in retail, what kind of trends do you foresee in direct to consumer, and what role will physical retail still have in understanding consumer trends?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question. It's obviously a very pertinent question in what we see happening today. It was a very interesting journey. I'm sure we can touch on this a little further too, which is that the journey of an organization that was predominantly a wholesale, meaning we sold to our customers, and those customers sold to our consumers, right? And so there was always somebody in between the relationship between the brand and the consumer. And the discussions that we had, and certainly I have a very strong view to it, which is that in order to really understand your consumer, you need to sort of have that direct relationship. That direct relationship gives you very direct feedback. So physical retail is one dimension of getting direct feedback. Another dimension is now, as we call it, DTC, or as we call it like online. That's another dimension. One of the things I always think about is that I try and always like challenge the question, right? Physical, is it physical digital, or is it like giving consumer access to the products in whichever way they want to choose to get it? That can be sometimes enhanced by a physical experience, somebody specifically explaining something to you where you want to try it on and have that kind of experience, or a digital experience where you know what you want, or you're willing to try it at home and send it back, right? So they're all different manners. What I think is going to be interesting, right? And this is where I, love to think about, right? Which is, where does retail go, right? What is the concept of a store, right? A store is around us every single day. The store is in our hand. It's called a phone, right? So imagine that today, it's very possible, I could see a friend with a pair of sneakers on. I could take a picture of that sneaker and buy instantaneously, have it at my house in my size, in the color that I wanted before I even got home, right? So suddenly I could see a product on a billboard, or I could see a picture of a product, and I can take it right there and buy. So suddenly all the sort of like friction points between seeing, wanting, and getting, we can break them down, right? That's to me the fascination in retail. As you look forward, you go, some people go, oh, that like 5 years ago, people were like, oh, that's crazy. What are you talking about? Now you think back and you go to when you first used Shazam, right? Remember the first time you used it, you were like, oh my God, this is genius. How is this possible? Right? Today, that's kind of like, yeah, come on, really? Like my kids go like, really, Dad? You think that's like kind of cool?
Right, right.
Right? But the idea of stores in that concept or buying in that concept or getting what you want in that concept to me becomes really interesting. So I don't even think that's in the early future, right? That's kind of here already. So when I think about the role of physical retail, I think we will continue to find new ways to experience how we buy things, how we learn about things, right? And how we feel like we can get what we want when we want it in whatever way we want it. And the more knowledge that we give organizations or we share with them, the better they should be able to serve us if their intent is about serving, right? As opposed to is their intent just about using, right? So to me, that's the power of maybe the new form of retail, which is how do I better serve the person who I'm actually trying to create something for.
Absolutely. And so, we're in the midst of this very trying pandemic period. And we've seen changes in three broad arenas: the media markets, the world of the consumer, and enterprise management. As you've experienced the pandemic as a business executive and as an investor, what adaptation to these new circumstances and what emergent trend that's been accelerated by the pandemic have you been most surprised by and taken note of?
Yeah, yeah. It has been like a lot of it. I was actually, and again, I think I mentioned this to you once before, and I definitely would love to share it with the group. But one of my most favorite quotes is a quote by William Gibson, and the quote basically says, "The future is already here. It is just unevenly distributed." Right? And what I loved about that quote was that you could find an insight or something that was taking place in a far off country or in a small micro group. And you might go, that's amazing, but it was just only accessible to a few people. And suddenly it becomes broad. So a lot of what I saw around the pandemic was a lot of that, a lot of things that you were like, we knew they were out there. We just didn't really know until we were forced to kind of go change the circumstance to now use them. So retail, we saw digital retail accelerate. We saw the companies who were ready for that. They could absolutely use that. You saw what happened in restaurants. You suddenly saw the market of delivery of food, all the things that are now we're seeing take place. They were already in play. They just accelerated. The one that was to me surprising and continued to open my eyes was really the office one, right? In the sense of like how quickly we adjusted. And it was suddenly like, remember, everyone hated like a conference call or like, oh, that was a terrible experience. Who wants to do that? And suddenly we adjusted to this new way of operating. Now this is buried in. An interesting one is where do you work from? Right? Like, frankly, I've got friends and folks who have jobs, good jobs. And they're like, I'm like, where are you? Oh, I'm in the Cayman Islands right now and I'm working from there. And I'm like, excuse me? Right? So all of a sudden, this sort of like freedom to actually work from different places. That one, I kind of should have known, but it just surprised me how quickly that's going to become the norm. And so when you look at hospitality, that's going to change fundamentally because I think that we're going to see people do more long haul staying. We're going to see people work from different places. And we're also going to see companies, and we're seeing it, adjust to that. That was an interesting one. Obviously, the medical field of being able to sort of like have a doctor online, it would have been like a thing that you would have said, oh no, who would do that? Now we're like, yeah, I'd do that, no problem, right? So a lot of the things were here. I was just surprised by what was so obvious, but yet it's still, it'll still be interesting to see how it plays itself out. So that was maybe one of
Absolutely.
them.
Absolutely. And so, one last point or question I wanted to ask you about shifts within digital. A number of companies over the last several years have pulled their ads from social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube because of their reluctance or inability or tardiness in dealing with misinformation and hate speech. What's your view over, and Nike and Coca-Cola, McDonald's, all part of that boycott. What's your view on that pushback against the platform companies from the big bellwether brands about their governance?
Yeah, yes. It I actually think I think at some point there's got to be it's either the consumer pushes back, and I think sometimes the consumer is pushing back, but if that's not felt in the right way, then the companies don't respond, right? And so I think that it's been good to see companies step up and actually speak what they believe. But I would also say that before you speak, make sure that you're doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing. It's like, make sure that as an organization, it's like, it's great to speak about, companies should do better around X, Y, and Z. Companies should do better about hate speech. And you go, but make sure you're not allowing hate speech in your organizations, right? Start with your own house, fix your house, then start to jump out and think about how you can help the system change, right? And I think that's and maybe that's a value system. Maybe that's something that my parents always they'd hit you hard on, like, don't be commenting other people's stuff. Get your stuff together, right? And I sometimes feel that it's been worthwhile to see the companies step out and do stuff, but it can't be performative. It can't be, I'm just doing this just because it seems cool to say it. When you dig deeper into their organizations and what they're doing, they're not addressing some of the issues that exist in their organizations. And so I think that's really, really important. So,
well, it seems like we're at a real moment right now. In my doctoral seminar this semester, we started the semester reading a book by a Harvard Business School professor named Rebecca Henderson called Rethinking Capitalism, or Reimagining Capitalism. And a big component of the book was this phenomena you're well aware of, the ESG phenomena, the environment, social governance movement, that's got equal parts sustainability concerns and people development concerns. So it seems like there's been this real shift in corporate America from a kind of shareholder purism and fundamentalism to more of a stakeholder posture where they're making a bargain with consumers that they're going to care more about them, they're going to care more about their communities. So what's the opportunity in this ESG movement and shift within the financial markets, the corporate sector, et cetera, for consumer brands? How can consumer brands go through the learning curve of what this is going to mean for their business while avoiding that greenwashing label you just kind of talked about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I think a lot about, like, even around that topic, like, and again, if I use that bias of the consumer bias, I would say this, which is that what we're seeing is younger consumers, or the consumers, the generation that's coming up, their values, they want to be with companies that meet or match their value system. So one of the reasons, beyond just, there is a part of it where it's like, it's just the right thing to do. A company exists in a system, right, as a part of society, right? And their role is beyond just the making of profit for themselves, because if you don't make profit and it somehow provides good positive reward around its own system, eventually that collapses, right? And so, if you create and destroy the planet, like, all bets are off. It's like, who are we kidding, right? So, but the younger consumer is even more attuned to this. And so they're actually choosing to buy from companies, or choosing to be serviced by companies that actually meet their sort of conscious yardstick, if I put it that way, right? And so I think that it's imperative for the organizations to get ahead of this. And I think most companies are still quite far behind, because the reason why, we manufactured a certain way, sometimes it was expedience, sometimes it was the only way to get it done. But if you have a path that you keep saying, I'm trying to improve, I'm constantly improving, then you can do that. So I believe that, as you said, environmental, social, the social governance part, I think they're all part of the organization being part of a bigger system.
Mhm.
And I was talking to, there was another group I've been doing some work with around sustainability, and it's not easy, right? You have to make conscious choices in terms of how you create products, whether you should even be creating another product, right? And so I think what companies need to do is you have to say, where am I today? Where would I like to be at a point in time? Embed it in your system and work hard, diligently, and being honest with yourself about where you are so you can make progress for the future, right? And that's having the right metrics in your system, looking at the right things, having the clear values in your organization that reinforce these things, because it is very easy for people to make different decisions, right?
Absolutely.
Make the expedient decision, make the decision that seems like if cost were the only measure, we would go here. Having said that, if we put a bigger sort of price, it's more than cost, it's also the cost and the implications of actually what you're doing to the environment, to the social community that you're serving. So I think putting those pieces together is really important. But I'm a strong believer. It starts at the CEO level. It starts with the board being very clear with the CEO, because that's the people who are going to sustain it over time. And it's their values that drive it through an organization.
Well, it's really interesting, because where ESG is concerned, the corporations are definitely making a sea change. They're stepping up, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Another area where we're seeing a same sort of shift is with respect to diversity.
Yeah.
And I know you're very passionate about diversity and advancements for African Americans and a whole host of historically disenfranchised groups. And so, with what happened this past summer with the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, the Black Lives Matter movement acceleration around those events amid a pandemic, what is the responsibility of companies in a moment like that and in a moment like this, where racial and social justice is concerned?
Yeah, I think that when you really think about it, and you think about the size of some of the corporations today, you think of the impact of these corporations, and you think about it and you kind of go, wow, you could be a country. Some of their own revenue is greater than the GDP of many countries, right? And so you go, the power of influence that this organization has is huge, is massive. And so when you think about the experiences of people of color within, like, whether it's, Black people, brown people, and you also think about, people of Asian descent, and you think about the experiences they're having within organizations, then you think about the experience women are having in organizations, you go, companies can do better. But they can do better if they actually believe at their core that they need to do better, right? You have to start with that belief of, you know what, everyone's created equal. Our job is, and wouldn't it be amazing if we had a diverse organization, because that diversity of thought actually drives better solutions all across the market. So as it relates to what we saw, I think we saw a clear reckoning, and I believe that companies need to put in place real programs. And I say that in terms of how you bring somebody into the organization, how you develop that person within the organization, how you promote that person in the organization, right? How you pay attention to the attrition in your organization, how you ensure that when you look top to bottom, does your organization reflect the diversity of the consumers who you serve. And, and everyone then says, well, it's really hard to find people of color who are talented. Just to say those words reeks, you just go, that's not true, because you haven't looked, and you haven't looked in the right places. It is hard to find women who are extremely talented. Not true. These are not true. And so organizations have to be they have to be committed by their spirit, but they have to be committed by their actions to actually create change. Right?
So what do you think will be different this time around?
You know what?
I'll at least speak for myself. I'm not gonna, you look so remarkably young, but I'm old enough to remember having seen similar moments of like this that turned out to be false dawns on the horizon. What will make this moment different, do you think?
I think, I think it's the absolute right question. And I know I'm actually older than you. So, but I would say this, I think that employees, customers, consumers, I think it's our job to hold companies accountable. I think that we use the strength of the people to actually help create change. It's like I think that there are times when you have to call out greenwashing or whatever word you use, where you have to sort of say, you know what, your actions and your what you say are not aligned, right? And so I believe that the transparency of information is going to actually allow a change in behavior. And I believe that also the consciousness of our younger consumer, I think they're going to help drive that change. And again, think about it a bit like the digital transformation. Everyone said, okay, yeah, you should go digital. You should make sure that this is all done. And companies are like, yeah, but I'm busy. I got stores. I don't need that. We're good. Oh, no, you should really do this. Oh, no, we're good. What? Out of nowhere, you get a black swan event called the pandemic. It changes every dynamic that you thought that you had to. The companies that actually choose to reset their standards and who they are the companies that are going to survive a future black swan event. And who knows what it's going to be. But I truly believe that if they are better prepared, because they do the things that they should have done, and you don't end up with like being boycotted or that everyone is suddenly turned against your organization, but you did it because you believed it. It's one of the things that I've been spending some time with some folks talking about, and they talk about it as like, anti-racism. Like rather than just diversity, anti-racism, we are against it. We believe that every person should be valued in an organization, right? So having a slightly different stand, not a defensive posture, a posture that basically says, if we do this, we could be a better organization. We could see better growth because the people that we've brought in bring a new perspective to that organization, and they help us think about how to grow the business and sustain the business over time.
Absolutely.
I have my soapbox, so
No, but one last little moment for you to speak on that point. In your time since you left Nike, I know you've doubled down on your commitment to these equity concerns. Tell us a little bit about some of the work you're doing to amplify diverse advancement and the closing of the wealth gap, which is another area, the gap between mainstream white Americans and Black Americans that the pandemic has just pulled the cloak from. What do you tell us about what you're doing both in the diversity front and the wealth gap front?
Yeah, no. So on the actually, I've kind of tried to, in some zones, I'm trying to put those two things together. And in one of the things that you see, and it's quite well talked about, so it's nothing new, but I think the number is something like $147 billion in sort of venture capital, right? 1% of that went to Blacks, right? And you kind of go, in the biggest sort of like shift of generational wealth, that's not going to Black founders or people trying to create opportunities, trying to create businesses where they could change the trajectory not only of their lives but of their community, right? And so that's a space that I'm working with a couple of folks on, where, you know, really breaking it down to understand where is the choke point, right? And a lot of the choke point comes down to, a lot of times people would say when they go to sort of ask for venture capital, the common thing is like, well, you can get from your aunt and uncle, you know, your friends and family. And it's kind of like, yeah, no, that's not my friends and family, right? And so we've looked at like, where are one of the choke points, and that's one of the major choke points. Another choke point is, you know, even once you get funded, right, the tools to scale, the knowledge to scale. So I'm spending time in that space. We're doing some work with a stealth group trying to figure out how to get into like, okay, and we're not the only one, there's others doing it, but spending time trying to think about how do you get funds to, you know, to startups, to founders, to people who have a community, you know, they're looking at it for their community and trying to create a business opportunity. So that's one of the spaces, you know, that I'm working with. The other one is I'm working with a lot of, you know, sort of startup founders to hear their challenges, also be a mentor, right? To mentor them, you know, along the way. I'm also doing this on the separate side. I'm also doing a lot of work around sustainability in terms of how to help companies. I was working with a group out of Asia who has a sustainable hotel. You're like, how do they actually really embed that in their business and grow it? So I've got a couple different, you know, sort of zones I'm working in, and no matter what I do, it's not enough. You know, it's like you just sit there and you kind of go, you need more people to be, you know, getting out and starting businesses. It's like, start businesses, get within organizations. All of those things are a part of, you know, creating this change that we believe is absolutely necessary. And think about it, all the technology that's out there.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm fascinated by that. I'll definitely be following up with you about some of those vectors. So, you know, just to begin kind of winding down, speaking about back to the organizational culture space, a lot of people on this call will be looking for early stage career opportunities within established companies. I'm sure we have some aspiring founders on the call, but I'm sure the lion's share of people will be working for established companies. In previous interviews, and perhaps even with conversations we've had, you said that while you were at Nike, the posture you adopted to kind of keep yourself flexible, intellectually speaking, was to refuse to become an insider. You said you fought the gravitational pull of becoming an insider. What did you mean by that? And why did you adopt that kind of that position on the boundary? And what would you impart to the younger audience members on our call about the virtues of that?
Yeah, interesting. There's two perspectives on it, and I'll first go to, you know, one of the reasons I liked to take that viewpoint was I always felt that, I think there's a way that, and this isn't my frame, but I thought that Jeff Bezos said it in a slightly different way, which was like, you know, let every day be day one, right? The outside posture for me was so that I could always look with fresh eyes at the business. I could see the business through the eyes of the people who were newly joining the organization. I could see this like, okay, I could fight the dogma, right? And I remember, you know, there was somebody at Nike that said this, and I think she said it really well. It was many years ago. She said, we make shoes, we make clothing, and the rest we make up, right? And I thought it was a brilliant line, because it was like, and the rest we make up. And I remember one time when somebody came to me and they said to me, hey, listen, you know, they were basically telling me the rules. And I said to them, I made that up. I personally made that up. Don't buy that. That's change. Don't, that's not a rule. That was a guide, and that was back then. And so if you understand my point is the outsider's perspective allowed me to be open to change, to be open to looking at it with fresh eyes, to see the opportunity as opposed to see the history of where you've been and hold on to a history that doesn't allow a company, you yourself individually, to continue to grow. So that's one dimension of it. And that was like the very conscious dimension. There's another dimension of it, which is, can feel slightly different, which is I was a Black male in Beaverton, Oregon. I'm from the UK. I liked football and basketball, but I wasn't really into running. I was always playing an away game. I was always at an away field. And so in order to almost like, you kind of get to a point where you go, accept that, accept your difference. Let your difference actually be how you thrive, right? And for me, that was kind of how I used it, which was I made it become fuel for me in terms of energy, but it was also sometimes maybe even a defensive posture, which is that I was never going to be accepted in that group. And you know what? I'm just not that group then. So that's okay, right? And that has its own consequences, right? But that's just being as honest with this group, and as I probably have even, I'm like reflecting as I'm even saying it, I'm like, this is an interesting thing. I mean, but I was conscious about like,
we probably,
it's an away game.
We share that truth. Those of us who fought different battles in different arenas, that's a very common thread. So either from that perspective or something very germane to your day-to-day under the hood with the business, looking back as I get ready to wind down, what was your biggest challenge at Nike? Maybe it was along the lines of what you were just speaking about. And then when you think about your legacy at the company, what was your greatest accomplishment that you will always hold dear as you move forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, I would say, I think lies within what I just spoke about. Ultimately, there's the business challenges, all those things are, that's the job, that's what you do. I think that the cultural challenge perhaps, played a lot more, it was a lot more challenging than even I basically, my whole strategy was like, at some point, ignore it, just kind of, keep doing what you do. But as anybody who's, from a diverse perspective, they might understand, it's like, in a way, you don't bring your whole self every day. And so every day you're working with that, like, you're constantly trying to shift and make sure that you're doing that. And that's, so my sharing to everybody is, be you, be you, do you, right? And if the place isn't right for you to do you, go someplace else, go find something else, because there is a place that will find and sort of like not only accept you, that will help you to thrive, not survive. If you're in an organization and you're surviving, that ain't it. That's not it, right? And so I really think that was important. So my biggest challenge was helping to bring people into the organization who were diverse. And I'll tell you this, for me, that diversity, and people might go, that wasn't all about people of color. That was diversity from a gender perspective. Could you get, like, and I think I mentioned this to you before, one of the things I'd often hear, somebody would come up for a promotion, and if it was a person of color or if it was a female, you'd often get this question of like, yeah, but, and I could always predict the but was coming before it was even said. And so I would be like, but what about, so I'd have to be like, but what about this? What about this? What about this? Right? And so that was my biggest challenge. My biggest challenge was helping an organization to become more diverse. And then most importantly, sustaining it.
Mm.
I would even say I think I underestimated what it would take to sustain it. To be very frank with it with this group, in terms of accomplishment, I think being able to frame a way of thinking for an organization. I mean, I was fortunate to be on a brand in a company that it was for the 20 odd years, whatever, that I happened to lead the brand functions and all the things I did. It was the number one brand in every time. So I take some knowledge, some kind of like, okay, I helped do that. But the stuff that was maybe more important was framing the thinking, right? Which is that having that consumer-centric way of thinking, that way of thinking about, how we serve people and consumers. And many of the folks who I got to work with, though some are still at Nike and many are in other places, and I still talk to them to this day, and they still reach out to me today. And that, honestly, that warms me the most. It's when they call up and say, Trev, hey, could you help us think through this challenge we're doing? Tomorrow I'm having a lunch with another CMO, and he's going through like, okay, tell me how to think about that. And I that for me is supremely rewarding, because it gives you that sense of being able to help people and still be able to help them, and hopefully they can impart their knowledge on others. So the work and the business and all the things that you do, you love those. But at the end of the day, it's still a human thing, right? It's about people you work with, people you enjoy working with, and people who have helped you along the way. And I've had many who helped me, and I can sort of like, pay it forward. Absolutely. And that's always been my thing. It's like, pay it forward, right?
Absolutely.
I teach my sons this, give it back to somebody else. And so, I think that's the thing I think a lot about.
Well, one last question before I let you go. I'm so appreciative of your time. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, right, this week getting prepared to speak with you, we had this awful tragedy with Tiger Woods and the crash down in Orange County. And, you partnered at your 20-year plus career at Nike with the most influential athletes in the world, Tiger, Serena, LeBron. As you think about the way in which the brand became so closely connected with those type of celebrity athletes, what do you think is the legacy of Nike with respect to that? And what were the pros and cons and challenges and tremendous rewards of working with celebrities of that stature?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that I think that Nike really had embedded well, which was many people thought that the reason that Nike had these incredible sort of athletes that they worked with was, wasn't it great that they could promote them in communications and advertising? But what many didn't quite see was that they were really the most powerful R&D team that you could ever have, because these were the people who were at the top of their game, and we were creating performance products. And so the insights that we got from the greatest athletes in the world, every challenge that they threw at us, it was a gem. That was the seed of innovation that created so many of the great products that Nike created over the years. And somebody earlier sort of flagged up the mercurial, and I'll give this one story very quickly, was that Ronaldo, the first Ronaldo, the Brazilian, we were trying to create a football boot for him, a soccer boot. And we kept on putting Nike Air in the soccer boot, which would raise him off the ground. And he kept on getting, like, we give it to him and he wouldn't wear it. And he wore it and he just said he didn't like it. And Nike at first was like, no, you need to wear it. This is better for you. It's going to protect you. And he was like, I don't want it. He would not wear it. And so eventually we said to him, so, okay, what would be the best boot that we could give you? And he said, my barefoot with studs. It wasn't even like, it wasn't a considered thought. It wasn't like, oh, let me rash. It just went, my barefoot with studs. That allowed Nike to use the track spike technology to create the mercurial that made it the most successful football boot ever. And I say that in the sense of that's what those great athletes did. They provided us an incredible insight into how to create amazing products and to think about sports from that perspective. Now, the other side of that, those incredibly performant athletes, they have spent their entire life crafting something, being perfect in that sport, are yet just humans. And they have the same frailties that we all have. They make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes get so blown up that it is, and particularly in today's world, you can see how that has an implication for the companies that they are partnered with. And rightfully so. It's not, I don't say that with any light, that shouldn't be the case, because it's the hand that feeds you that creates another challenge for you, right? And so that was always the challenge, right? That sometimes that we chose them for their incredibly great performance as athletes, but we celebrate them as sometimes perfect humans, which they're not. And that gap can be incredibly challenging for the athlete, even more so for them, and then sometimes for the company. So the good and the bad of it, right? And so for me, that was always the thing. It's like understanding that they are human, and that, and sometimes they make mistakes and they do things, and sometimes they behave badly and they're wrong, and you need to be able to mark the line to those things. But that was part of like trying to build a brand. And in today's context, that has become even more acute than anything else that we're seeing.
Well, fabulous. Well, Trevor Edwards, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us. I'll definitely be following up with you about some of these venture conversations. And hopefully you'll be able to join us again before too long, and hopefully one day in person,
I'd love to.
pandemic permitting. So thanks so much.
Yeah,
thank you everyone for joining us.
Listening, and hopefully it's been helpful. And but thanks again for inviting me.